Get out of my seat, now, or I will have airport police drag you out in front of everyone. Captain Daniel Cross stood in the aisle of first class on Meridian Sky, Flight 8112, parked at Gate B14 at O'Hare International, his 4 gold stripes catching the cabin light, his voice pitched low enough to sound reasonable, and loud enough to make sure every passenger in row 1 through 6 heard exactly what he wanted them to hear. His cap was tucked under his left arm. His jaw was set the way it gets set on men who have never once been told no by someone they didn't expect to say it. In seat 2A, a woman named Vivian Marsh did not move. Her hands rested flat on the armrests. Her gray wool coat was folded neatly across her lap. Her posture didn't beg. Her face didn't flinch. And that, more than anything else, seemed to be what made Captain Cross's neck redden above his collar. "I already scanned my boarding pass twice," Vivien said. "Both times it came back green." Behind him, senior flight attendant Denise Halloway stood with a tablet pressed to her chest like a shield, her lanyard swinging slightly with the recycled cabin air. She was 51 years old, 17 years with the airline, and absolutely certain she knew what first class was supposed to look like. It did not, in her mind, look like Vivian Marsh. "Captain," Denise said, "we have a passenger refusing crew instruction." Vivian's eyes moved to her, not with anger, just with a kind of tired clarity, the look of someone who has seen this exact scene before, in a different city, on a different day, wearing a different coat. Rewind 11 minutes. At 6:41 that morning, Vivian Marsh had walked up the jet bridge at O'Hare, wearing scuffed brown loafers and carrying a canvas tote bag with a coffee stain on the strap. She looked like a woman who taught high school chemistry or ran a small non-profit downtown. She looked, in other words, like nobody. That was the entire point. She had built her company on the principle that nobody should be treated like nobody, and the only way to know whether that principle was surviving contact with reality was to go and stand quietly inside it, unannounced, and watch. A man 3 rows back lifted his phone and started filming, the way people do now, instinctively, before they've even decided whether something is worth remembering. Another passenger stared hard at a folded newspaper, though his eyes hadn't tracked a single line in almost a minute. Across the aisle, in 2C, a retired judge named Walter Higgins watched Vivian's face over the rim of his reading glasses. He had spent 31 years on the bench in Cook County. He had seen loud power and rich power, and the kind of power that needs an audience to feel real. What he was looking at now was none of those. It was quieter. It didn't need to announce itself, which was exactly why it made men like Daniel Cross so uneasy. "Mrs. Marsh," the captain said, stretching the name out, like it might not be real. "There appears to be an issue with your seat assignment." "There is no issue," Vivien said. "Seat 2A is printed on my boarding pass, and it matched the manifest when I checked in at 5:58 this morning." Denise's fingers tightened around the tablet edge until her knuckles went pale. "Sometimes passengers misunderstand a complimentary upgrade code," she offered. Her voice sugared just enough to sound like concern and sharp enough underneath to be something else entirely. "I did not misunderstand anything," Vivien said. A ripple moved through the cabin, that specific hush that settles over a room when everyone can feel something is about to break and nobody wants to be the one holding it when it does. Someone 2 rows back whispered, "Here we go," under their breath. Captain Cross leaned in, just slightly, just enough to change the temperature of the air between them. "Ma'am," he said, "I am responsible for the safety of this aircraft. If my crew tells me a passenger is being disruptive, I take that seriously." "What exactly have I disrupted?" Vivien asked. The question landed and nobody answered it. Not Denise. Not the captain. Not the 22 passengers in first and business who had been watching this unfold since Denise first leaned over Vivian's seat and asked, not unkindly at first, "Are you sure you're in the right cabin, sweetheart?" Denise shifted her weight onto her other foot. Her cheeks had gone tight and pink. You became argumentative, she said. I answered your questions, Vivien said. Then I stopped answering them because I had already answered them twice. Captain Cross inhaled slowly through his nose, a man unused to being contradicted in front of an audience, especially not by someone speaking in a voice that never once climbed above conversational. Let me be very clear, he said. You can gather your things and walk off this aircraft under your own power, or I will have gate security remove you. Your choice. The man filming in row 4 raised his phone a few inches higher. A woman in 3B pressed her hand flat against her mouth, and then, from across the aisle, Walter Higgins lowered his newspaper into his lap. Captain, he said, his voice rough with age but perfectly steady. I watched her scan that boarding pass myself. She is in the correct seat. Denise turned on him fast. Sir, please, this is a crew matter. Respect isn't a crew matter, Walter said. It's a human one. That sentence moved through the cabin, the way a struck match moves through a dark room. The woman in 3B lowered her hand from her mouth. A businessman in 4C set his tablet face down on his tray table. Even the man filming in row 4 went still for a second, his screen glowing uselessly in his palm, as if the moment itself had gotten too big for a 15-second clip. Captain Cross felt something shift beneath him, not gone yet, but loosening, and it made his voice sharpen instead of soften. Mr. Higgins, remain seated. Mrs. Marsh, this is your final instruction. Gather your belongings. Vivian's fingers came to rest on the edge of the leather portfolio tucked beneath the seat in front of her. No, she said. One word. Clean. Final. Denise's face flushed a deep, blotchy red. Captain, she said, her voice climbing. She just directly refused a crew instruction. I want that on the record. Vivien reached down and unzipped the portfolio. The sound of the zipper seemed absurdly loud in a cabin. Gone that silent, metal teeth parting. One small mechanical sound carrying the weight of everything that hadn't been said yet. A slim black folder emerged, unmarked, unremarkable. Captain Cross took a half-step back. Don't hand me anything, he said quickly. I'm not handing you anything, Vivien said. I'm showing you something you should have checked before you threatened to have me removed from an aircraft I own 11% of and sit on the board of. She turned the folder around and set it flat on the tray table. Denise saw the letterhead first. Meridian Sky Holdings. Her eyes dropped a line lower. Internal Passenger Equity Audit. Confidential. Prepared for Vivian R. Marsh, founder, chairwoman, and chief executive officer. Denise stopped breathing for a second that stretched much longer than a second. Captain Cross's expression moved through 3 distinct stages in under 4 seconds. Irritation first, then confusion. Then something that looked almost like physical pain as recognition fought its way through disbelief and started to win. That could be printed by anyone, he said, but his voice had already lost its floor, the words coming out thinner than he meant them to. Vivien reached into the folder a second time and produced a company identification card. Not laminated for show, not dramatic, just official. Her photograph, her full legal name, her title, printed in small, unglamorous type, founder, chairwoman, and chief executive officer, Meridian Sky Holdings. Denise's tablet slipped an inch in her hands. The whole cabin saw it happen. Somewhere behind the curtain in economy, a child laughed at something on a tablet screen, utterly unaware that first class had just quietly turned into a courtroom with no judge and no jury, and only one verdict left to reach. I came aboard this aircraft as a paying passenger, Vivien said, her voice never once rising. Not as your boss. Not as anyone's boss. I came here to find out whether the reports crossing my desk for the last 8 months were true. Denise's lips parted. Nothing came out. I wanted them to be wrong, Vivien continued, and for the first time her voice did something new. It softened. It did not break. It softened, and somehow that was worse, because a broken voice asks for pity and a soft one simply states a fact you cannot argue with. I wanted to believe our training worked. I wanted to believe that when a woman who looks like me sits quietly in a seat she paid $4,190 for, nobody in a Meridian Sky uniform decides on sight that she must be the problem. Captain Cross looked toward the cockpit door, then toward the forward galley, hunting for some procedure, some script, some line in the manual that could save him. There wasn't one. There never had been one for this, Denise whispered. Miss Marsh, I didn't know. That, Vivien said, is exactly the problem. You shouldn't need to know someone's title to offer them dignity. You shouldn't need to verify a person's net worth before you decide they deserve to be believed when their boarding pass already says everything you needed to know. The radio clipped to Captain Cross's belt crackled to life. Captain, dispatch, line 1. Operations is asking why an executive alert just triggered out of seat 2A. His face went the color of the tray table. Denise closed her eyes. The aircraft had not moved a single inch from the gate, and yet everything inside it had already shifted onto a different axis entirely. The radio hissed once more and fell quiet. Captain Cross looked down at it, like the small black device had personally betrayed him. Every ounce of authority he'd carried into that aisle 4 minutes ago now felt like a costume 2 sizes too heavy. Captain, dispatch said again, sharper this time. Operations needs confirmation. Are you currently with Vivian Marsh, seat 2A? The whole cabin heard it. Heads turned in unison. Phones lifted higher. The man in row 4 whispered, "Oh my God," under his breath, but did not stop recording. Because some part of him already understood he was holding something people would want to see later. Captain Cross pressed the button on his radio. His thumb was shaking. "This is Captain Cross," he said. I'm with Miss Marsh." A pause on the other end, longer than it needed to be. Then, "Stand by for a direct call from Executive Operations. Do not remove the passenger. Repeat, do not remove the passenger." The words landed like a verdict read aloud in an empty courtroom. Denise's shoulders dropped an inch. Her mouth opened and then closed again with nothing in it. She glanced at Vivien and then looked away fast, the way people look away from something too bright to hold eye contact with. Shame had finally found her, but it had arrived 9 minutes too late to undo anything that had already happened in front of 22 witnesses and 1 recording phone. Vivien folded her hands in her lap. She did not smile. She did not gloat. That, more than the folder, more than the identification card, more than the radio call, was what made the moment so heavy. She looked like a woman standing over wreckage she had spent 8 months hoping she wouldn't find, and had just found anyway, in the worst possible way, in front of people who would carry the story off this plane, whether she wanted them to or not. Walter Higgins watched her and understood something the others hadn't caught yet. This wasn't revenge. This was grief, wearing the clothes of discipline. Captain Cross cleared his throat. "Miss Marsh," he said, forcing the words through a mouth gone dry. "There appears to have been a misunderstanding." "No," Vivien said quietly. "There was an assumption." The cabin went still again in that particular way that means people are turning a sentence over in their heads, looking for the edges of it. A misunderstanding is an accident, a glitch in a system, a wrong number on a screen, a mistake anyone could make and nobody meant. An assumption is a choice. An assumption has eyes. An assumption has a voice. And today it had worn a Meridian Sky uniform and stood in the aisle of first class telling a paying customer to get out of her own seat on her own airline. Denise flinched like the word had physically touched her. "I was following procedure," she said, quieter now. Vivien turned to her fully for the first time. "Which procedure told you to question my ticket after it scanned green? Which procedure told you to smile at me while your captain threatened to have me removed by force? Which procedure, Miss Halloway, told you that I didn't belong in this seat?" No one breathed. Even the air handling system seemed to have gone quiet, or maybe it just felt that way, the way a room feels when everyone in it has stopped moving at once. Denise's face reddened further, her eyes going bright and wet. Not with innocence, but with the particular panic of watching your own choices walk back into the room wearing witnesses. "I didn't mean it like that," she whispered. "That," Vivien said, her voice softening again in that terrible, gentle way, "is what people say right before they understand exactly what they meant." In row 3, a woman named Priya Anand lowered her phone slowly. She was a civil rights attorney based out of a firm on LaSalle Street, and she had spent 19 years listening to people describe pain they were exhausted from having to explain to strangers who should have already known better. She recognized the look on Vivien's face immediately. She had seen it in deposition rooms and courtrooms and school board meetings, the specific look of someone who is running on fumes but will still, somehow, get every fact exactly right. "Miss Marsh," Priya said, leaning into the aisle. "I recorded the entire exchange. From the moment Miss Holloway first questioned your boarding pass." Denise's head snapped toward her. "I also heard the captain refuse to verify the manifest before threatening removal," Priya added, her voice even. Captain Cross turned pale a second time. "Ma'am, I'd ask that you not interfere with flight operations." "I'm not interfering," Priya said. "I'm preserving evidence." Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few wore the particular expression of people who had just realized their silence, which had felt neutral 30 seconds ago, now felt like a decision they'd made and would have to live with. An older woman across the aisle raised her hand slightly, almost like a student, unsure whether she was allowed to speak. "I saw the boarding pass too," she said, her voice trembling. "It said 2A. I should have said something sooner." Vivien looked at her. The woman's eyes filled. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Thank you," Vivien said. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was acknowledgement, and sometimes acknowledgement is the very first small repair in a room full of people who had all just discovered how easily their courage could go quiet. Captain Cross's cell phone rang inside his jacket pocket, a sharp electronic bleat that seemed too loud for the space. He pulled it out and stared at the screen. Executive Operations. His throat worked once before he answered. "Yes, this is Captain Cross." A pause. His eyes dropped to the carpet. "Yes, sir." Another pause, longer. "Yes, I understand." Denise watched him the way a person watches a judge about to read a sentence aloud. He lowered the phone slowly and turned to face Vivien directly. "Miss Marsh," he said, his voice now stripped of every ounce of the authority it had carried 9 minutes earlier. "Executive Operations has instructed me to apologize to you immediately and personally. They've also instructed that no further action be taken against you, and that this flight will not depart until you personally confirm that you feel safe remaining on board." Denise inhaled sharply enough that the sound carried 3 rows back. Vivien looked past the captain, toward the closed cockpit door, then down the aisle at the rows of passengers who had watched every second of this, then finally back to Denise. When she answered, she took her time. "I'll remain on board," she said. "But safety isn't only about whether an aircraft can fly. It's also about whether a person can sit in the seat they paid for without being treated like a threat." She reached out and picked her boarding pass up off the tray table, folding it once and setting it in her lap. No one moved, no one spoke, and in that silence, First Class finally understood what it had spent the last 11 minutes watching. This had never been a seating dispute. It was a mirror, and every single person in that cabin had just been forced to look into it. 2 hours into the flight, cruising at 36,000 feet, somewhere over eastern Nebraska, the cabin had gone quiet in a different way. Not tense now, just careful. The way people are careful after they've watched something they know they'll be telling their families about tonight. A man in 5A adjusted his reading glasses and pretended to study a quarterly report he hadn't turned a page of in 20 minutes. Denise moved through the aisle with small, careful steps and a voice she'd clearly turned down 2 full notches. Captain Cross stayed behind the cockpit door, but everyone could feel it. Something was still coming, the way you can feel weather building before you see the clouds. Vivien sat by the window, sunlight sliding across the wing outside. Her tablet was open, not to a movie, not to anything meant to pass the time. It was open to an internal complaint file she had carried onto this flight, in the same portfolio as her identification card. Names filled the screen. Not famous names, just names. A grandmother from a Detroit suburb had been asked to show her boarding pass 3 separate times after being seated in business class. A young ICU nurse flying home from a medical conference had been told, politely but unmistakably, that her seat must have been an upgrade error. A retired Army major, 81 years old, 3 tours, had been asked at the gate whether he could afford the fare he'd already paid in full. Vivien's eyes stopped on that last one. She had read these files before, at her desk, in a conference room, on a laptop at 11 at night. But reading them now in seat 2A, with the memory of Denise's voice still sitting in her chest like a stone, they didn't read like reports anymore. They read like voices sitting in the cabin with her. Denise came up the aisle with a meal tray for the passenger across from Vivien, her movements careful, exact, checked twice, and then a third time. Cloth napkin, polished silverware, the glass filled to exactly the same level as everyone else's, maybe even a fraction higher. "Ms. Marsh," she said quietly, setting a tray down, "your pre-ordered lunch. Grilled salmon, wild rice, green beans." "That's correct," Vivien said. Denise hovered a second longer than the moment required. "Ms. Holloway," Vivien said. Denise froze. "Don't overcorrect." Denise blinked, thrown. "The answer to poor treatment isn't special treatment once power gets revealed," Vivien said, her voice gentle but unmistakably firm. "The answer is consistent treatment before anyone knows there's power in the room at all." Denise's face tightened with something that looked almost like grief. "Yes, ma'am," she said, and stepped away slower than she'd arrived. Behind the cockpit door, Captain Cross finally pulled off his headset and dragged both hands down his face. First Officer Marcus Ibbotson watched him without comment for a long moment. "You need to make the log entry," Marcus said finally. "Accurately." "I know," Cross said. "This is bigger than protecting your record, Tom," Marcus said, and for a second Cross looked genuinely angry, then simply tired, then something closer to ashamed. He pulled the flight log toward him and uncapped his pen. Cabin conflict prior to departure. He began writing, then stopped, crossed it out with 2 hard lines. He started again. Passenger in seat 2A was challenged, despite valid boarding documentation. Captain failed to verify manifest before escalating to a removal threat. His pen hovered over the last word for a long moment. Threat. It looked exactly as ugly on the page as it had sounded out loud, because it was. Back in the cabin, Priya Anand's phone buzzed in her lap. She glanced down, read the message, exhaled through her nose. Her sister, texting from Baltimore, "Is this the airline CEO thing? Are you actually on that flight?" Priya typed back, "Yes. And she's calmer than the rest of us deserve." Across the aisle, Walter Higgins leaned toward the man beside him, a passenger named Owen Prescott, who had spent most of the last hour staring at his own hands. "You ever wonder how many times in your life you missed the chance to do the right thing?" Walter said, "just because it was inconvenient." Owen didn't look up right away. "More than I want to admit," he said. "Same here," Walter said, and the two of them sat with that for a while. No speeches, no excuses, just an old, plain kind of honesty settling into 2 sets of tired bones. An hour later, Vivien's phone lit up again. This time it was a message from Renata Kowalski, chair of the Meridian Sky Board. "Emergency board session confirmed for the moment we land. Media pressure already climbing. Legal recommending immediate suspension of both crew members pending investigation. Need your direction." Vivien read it twice. Then she looked down the aisle. Denise was helping an elderly passenger adjust a blanket around her shoulders. Somewhere behind the curtain in economy, a group of college kids were laughing softly at something on a shared screen. Life aboard the aircraft hadn't stopped for any of this. That was the strange, quiet cruelty of harm, she thought. It could become history for some people, while it was still actively happening inside somebody else's chest. She typed slowly. Preserve all evidence. Suspend judgment until every statement is complete. No public performance of accountability. Accountability has to be thorough, lawful, and human, or it isn't accountability, it's theater with better lighting. She sent it. Then, after a moment, she added a second message. Also, begin a company-wide review of every passenger treatment complaint filed in the last 2 years. I want patterns. I want names. I want to know which managers closed cases without reading them. Nothing gets buried again. Her thumb hovered over the screen for a second before she sent that one, too. Somewhere far below the aircraft, an entire company had just started to shake, quietly, one keystroke at a time, and none of the 20,000 employees on the ground had any idea yet that it had already begun. The descent into Reno began with a soft dip of the nose and a change in engine pitch that everyone felt before they consciously noticed it. Window shades came up. Late afternoon light spread across the cabin in pale gold bands. Below the wing, the desert stretched out flat and endless, and somewhere out there, waiting, was a boardroom already lit up, a legal team already assembled, and cameras already gathering outside a terminal that had no idea what was about to walk through it. Denise moved through the cabin, checking seatbacks for landing, her voice quieter now, stripped of its old, polished certainty. When she reached Vivien, she paused. "Ms. Marsh," she said softly. "Tray table and seatback, please, for landing." Vivien nodded and complied without a word. Denise looked for a moment like she wanted to say something more, then visibly caught herself and didn't. For once in the last 3 hours, she seemed to understand that not every feeling she was carrying needed to be handed to the person she'd hurt. She moved on. It was a small thing. It was also, in its own quiet way, real. In the cockpit, Captain Cross guided the aircraft down, through a thin layer of scattered cloud, while Marcus handled the radio calls to approach control. Clear skies, routine landing. Nothing about it felt routine to him. He stared at the runway lights coming up to meet them and heard his own voice from 3 hours earlier, replaying itself in his head, over and over, on a loop he couldn't shut off. "You can walk off this aircraft under your own power, or I will have you removed." He'd said it with total confidence. That confidence was the thing that frightened him now. Not the consequences, not the investigation waiting for him at the gate. The confidence itself, the ease with which it had come out of his mouth, the total absence of doubt in the moment he'd said it. "Gear down," Marcus said. Cross lowered the gear. A deep mechanical rumble moved up through the floor. Flaps set, Marcus confirmed a moment later. For a second, Cross let himself breathe. Then, barely above the hum of the cockpit air, he said, "After we land, I'm submitting a full written statement. No edits from legal first, no smoothing it out." Marcus glanced over at him. "Good," he said. "Better that way." Cross nodded once. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was, for the first time in 3 hours, a step in the direction away from hiding. The wheels touched down with a firm jolt, rubber meeting runway, engines reversing, the whole cabin leaning forward and then settling back. A few passengers exhaled, like they'd been holding their breath since Chicago. Nobody applauded. The aircraft slowed, turned, taxied toward the gate, in a silence that felt earned rather than empty. Vivien looked out at the terminal windows sliding past. Her own reflection looked back at her in the glass. A woman in a gray coat, calm eyes, a tired, setter mouth, still sitting in 2A. She thought, for just a second, of her father's hands, permanently stained with engine grease, guiding her small fingers across the instrument panel of a rented Cessna when she was 16 years old. "Never let anybody make you small in a place you earned your wings," he'd told her. The day after her first solo flight out of a grass strip in downstate Illinois, she had believed him then. Today she'd needed to prove it true again, in front of strangers, at $39,000 an hour in fuel costs, on an airplane that had her own name on the side of it. As the aircraft parked, phones came alive across the cabin all at once. Messages flooded in, news alerts, texts from family members, screens filling with the same 15-second clip from Priya's recording. Vivien seated, calm, unmoving, the captain standing over her, Denise a half step behind him with her tablet pressed to her chest like armor that hadn't worked. The seatbelt sign switched off. The chime sounded final. Nobody rushed to stand. That almost never happens in America, unless something bigger than carry-on luggage is holding people down in their seats. The moment the jet bridge door opened, Renata Kowalski boarded, followed by 2 representatives from corporate security and a woman from the ethics office named Corinne Whitfield. Mid-50s, gray-streaked hair, pulled back, a legal pad in her hand instead of a tablet, the kind of person who takes notes because she still believes handwriting, slows a lie down. Corinne looked at Vivien first. "Miss Marsh." "Corinne," Vivien said. Then Corinne turned to face the crew. "Captain Cross, Miss Holloway. We'll need your company devices, written statements, and every communication related to this incident. You're both relieved of duty, effective immediately, pending review." Denise's face crumpled. Captain Cross closed his eyes for one long second, then opened them and nodded. "Yes, ma'am," he said. No argument, no protest. That mattered more than either of them realized in the moment. A young flight attendant named Brian Cole stood near the forward galley, visibly shaken. Corinne turned to him too. "Mr. Cole, you're not relieved of duty at this time, but we'll need your statement." Brian swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I'll tell the truth." Vivien looked at him. He looked back, nervous but steady. That was all she'd ever wanted from any of them. Just the truth. Passengers began rising slowly. Walter Higgins reached for the cane resting against his seat. Owen Prescott helped him without being asked, and the 2 men exchanged a brief look. The particular look strangers share, after surviving a hard lesson together in the same small room. Priya Anand stepped into the aisle, phone tucked safely into her coat pocket now. "Miss Marsh," she said, "I'll send you everything before I even leave the airport." "Thank you," Vivien said. Priya hesitated. "I'm sorry you had to be the one to teach this lesson." Vivian's eyes softened. "So am I." They stood there a beat longer, 2 women who both understood, in their own separate ways, that teaching a hard truth to a room of strangers was still, somehow, its own kind of pain. At the aircraft door, Denise waited with her bag, already over one shoulder. She looked at Vivien, and for the first time in 3 hours, there was no performance left anywhere in her face. "I know an apology isn't enough," Denise said. "It isn't," Vivien agreed. Denise's eyes filled. "I accept that." Then Vivien said, "But the truth is a beginning." Denise's eyes overflowed. "I'll start there," she whispered. Vivien stepped off the plane and into the jet bridge. The air smelled like jet fuel, brewed coffee, and the faint metallic edge of an afternoon storm building somewhere over the mountains to the west. At the far end of the corridor, past the gate, a small crowd had already begun to gather. Some recognized her face from the videos circulating online. Some just recognized that something had happened. Phones lifted, but nobody crowded too close. Vivien kept walking. Not fast, not slow. Every step measured. She was no longer undercover. She was the owner of the other airline, walking directly into the public consequence of everything her company had allowed to happen, under its own name. And this time everyone in that terminal knew exactly who she was. The gate area at O'Hare went quiet the moment Vivian Marsh stepped into the terminal. Not fully quiet. Airports never go fully quiet. There were still rolling suitcases and boarding announcements, and the hiss of an espresso machine somewhere off to the left. But around gate B14, the noise pulled back like a tide going out. People recognized the woman from the video before most of them understood who she actually was. Then, gradually, they did. Vivien didn't stop for the cameras. She didn't raise a hand. She didn't perform pain for strangers who had only just discovered it online 40 minutes ago. She walked beside Corinne Whitfield, with Renata Kowalski a half step behind. And something in the way she moved made the crowd part on instinct, the way water moves around a stone that isn't going anywhere. A reporter called out from beyond the rope line. "Ms. Marsh, will the crew be terminated?" Vivien kept walking. Another voice, louder, "Do you believe this was discrimination?" This time she stopped. The terminal seemed to hold its breath. She turned, not toward the loudest camera, but toward the nearest cluster of ordinary passengers standing at the edge of the crowd. An elderly woman with one hand resting on a rolling suitcase. A young father with a sleeping toddler slumped against his shoulder. A janitor who had paused his cart to watch, like he understood he belonged to this moment too, even in a gray uniform with a mop bucket beside him. Vivien spoke clearly, her voice carrying without ever rising. "What happened on that aircraft today wasn't about me," she said. "It was about every person who has ever been treated as suspicious before they were treated as human." No one interrupted her. "This company will investigate fully," she continued. "The employees involved will receive due process. But let me be clear about something. Due process is not the same thing as silence. And compassion is not the same thing as avoiding accountability." A camera shutter clicked. Then another. No passenger should ever need a title, or money, or fame, or a stake in the company to be believed when their ticket is already valid in their hand, Vivien said. Respect has to come before recognition, not after it. The words moved through the terminal faster than any video clip had. Phones lowered, not all of them, but enough. Corinne Whitfield watched her with the expression of someone witnessing leadership in its most expensive form. Not power used to crush, but power used to correct. By the time Vivien's car pulled away from the curb, the emergency board meeting had already begun without her physically in the room. Screens lit up across the country: legal, human resources, flight operations, communications, union representation, all patched in at once. Renata Kowalski, tired but focused, spoke into the speakerphone the second Vivien's driver merged onto the Kennedy Expressway. "Vivien," she said, "we're ready for your direction." Rain had started to tap softly against the window. Vivien's reflection floated faintly in the dark glass beside her. "Start with the facts," she said. "Preserve every record. Interview every witness separately. No group statements. No coordinated stories. Suspend Captain Cross and Ms. Holloway with pay, pending the full investigation. No public humiliation. No scapegoating." A board member leaned into his microphone from somewhere in New York. "The public wants action, Vivien." Her eyes hardened slightly in the reflection. "The public deserves the truth," she said. "Action without truth is just theater with better lighting." Silence on the line for a moment. Then she continued, "Open every closed complaint from the last 2 years involving passenger profiling, unequal service, or improper removal threats. I want an independent civil rights auditor, someone with no ties to this company. I want retraining tied to actual consequences, not a slideshow nobody remembers by Friday. I want the managers who dismissed those cases reviewed individually. And I want every passenger who was harmed under this culture contacted directly by a human being, not a form letter." Renata was writing fast. "Understood," she said. Vivien looked down at her own hands resting in her lap. For the first time all day, they were trembling, just slightly, just enough to remind her, and everyone watching through their small glowing screens, that dignity had a cost, even for the person who owned the whole airline. Her voice slowed when she spoke again. I built this company because I believe travel could make people feel bigger, freer, more connected to each other, not less. If our own employees are making customers feel small, then we failed at the one thing we promised to be. And we're going to repair that in the open, not behind closed doors." No one spoke for a moment. Then Renata said softly, "We will." 3 weeks later, Meridian Sky Holdings released the findings publicly. Captain Daniel Cross admitted, in writing, that he had escalated the situation without ever verifying the passenger manifest, a violation of protocol he could not argue his way around, no matter how he tried. Denise Halloway acknowledged a pattern of unequal treatment toward passengers of color going back at least 14 months, entered a mandatory corrective review process, and ultimately resigned before it concluded. Not fired, but unable, in the end, to sit inside the consequences of what the investigation had surfaced about her own record. Keen. 4 regional managers were formally disciplined for closing prior complaints without proper review. The airline launched what internal memos began calling the Passenger Dignity Initiative. Not a poster in a break room, not a slogan on a boarding pass sleeve, but training rebuilt from the ground up using the real, specific, named stories that had been sitting buried in a complaint folder for 2 years. Vivien returned to seat 2A exactly 1 month later. Same route, same airline. No announcement, no press release, no camera crew waiting at the gate. This time, a young flight attendant named Brian Cole greeted her at the aircraft door. "Welcome aboard, Miss Marsh," he said. Then he caught himself and turned with the exact same warmth toward the woman boarding directly behind her. A grandmother with a cane and a nervous, uncertain smile, clearly unsure whether first class was really where she was supposed to be sitting. "Welcome aboard," Brian said again, and meant it exactly as much the second time. Vivien noticed, and for the first time in over a month, she smiled, quietly, to herself, because real change was never proven by how a company treated its own owner. It was proven by how it treated the next person nobody in that cabin recognized at all. If this story moved you, and you found yourself wondering whether you'd have spoken up in that cabin, or stayed quiet like so many of them did, that feeling is worth sitting with for a minute before you scroll away. Like this video if it reminded you that dignity should never require proof. Subscribe if you want more stories about the quiet moments where character actually gets tested. And leave a comment with 3 words: respect requires nothing.